This is our brand spanking new digital dash, and it's pretty sweet, except for the fact that installing it meant that we had to pull out our old gauges, which housed our oil pressure and our fuel level, and those are kind of important. So today, we're gonna install an aftermarket oil pressure sensor and wire it to our standalone ECU, and we're gonna teach the dash to monitor our fuel level again. I don't think it's gonna be very hard, but I've been wrong before, so let's go find out.
Big thank you to car insurance comparison site The Zebra for sponsoring today's episode. Some things in life should always be easy. For me, eating donuts is easy. For Job, doing donuts is easy. And for The Zebra, comparing car insurance is easy. So I figured, why not give you 52 seconds of that all combined?
The Zebra makes it easy to compare car insurance. All you have to do is enter some basic info and boom, you can compare top insurance companies side by side, including all major carriers, so you guys can see who can offer you the best value for the coverage you need. Better yet, there's no techie jargon or spam calls you have to deal with, just honest and to the point insurance comparison. And the Zebra has experts that can answer the car insurance questions that keep you up at night, like, will my policy be affected if I mod my car? The best part about the Zebra is they have no stake in what policy you choose. So whether you're looking to save an average of $440 a year on your policy or simply get the most bang for your buck, the Zebra has got your back.
So take it from me, a donut host eating a donut while a car does donuts, that you'll be thankful you found a friend like the Zebra. Head on over to thezebra.com/moneypit and start comparing your options today.
And enjoy the last few seconds of this bizarre, slow motion, modernist piece of cinema while the tagline plays over top.
Now, if you've been watching this show for a while, you may remember when we replaced our analog gauges with that DDE-EFI digital dash. Now, we bought that thing for about 700 bucks, which isn't very cheap, but the cool thing about it is that it connects directly to our Megasquirt standalone ECU, so we can tell our dash all sorts of engine vitals. And in case you didn't know, engine vitals are kind of important. But that brings us to today. We lost our oil pressure, which is the ultimate engine vital, when we removed our stock gauges. So today we gotta get oil pressure back in front of our eyeballs, which means installing an aftermarket sensor and wiring it into our Megasquirt ECU, and then making it come up on the dash. But that's gonna be the last thing we're gonna do, because I think it's gonna take the most time. We're gonna knock out a few easier things first. So we're gonna fix the refresh rate to get the lag that we're seeing out of there. Then we're gonna get our GPS speedo working, and then we're gonna work on our fuel level. And then once we're done with all that, we will install the oil pressure sensor. And then finally, the pièce de résistance. We're gonna put a bezel over the thing so it doesn't look half done. I can't wait. That's been bugging me forever. So let's get into it. Now, as far as difficulty is concerned, I don't think this is gonna be that difficult of a job. There is gonna be a fair amount of work involved since we're doing a handful of things, but most of it's gonna be easy. I'm sure there's gonna be some head scratching involved with actually getting the ECU to read the correct values, but I'm positive we can tackle it. Although something does always tend to come up. So we'll see. So first I'm gonna start the car up so we can look at kind of how laggy the RPMs are right now. So as I blip the throttle, take a look at the revs and you'll see that they kind of lag. It's a little chunky. You see, it's lagging behind. It's not quite in real time. So we need to update that. It's called the lag factor, go figure. And that should look a lot smoother. Let's do that first. All right, so to update the lag factor, I'm just gonna go into basic load settings, then general settings. So as we go into fixing this and see how relatively easy it is, you might be wondering why I didn't do that the first time around. And honestly, it's just because I didn't know what to do. I emailed the owner of the company that makes this dash and he sent me a whole bunch of info on how to get all the little kinks worked out. So that's super helpful and is gonna make this way easier than if I was just poking around trying to figure it out. So I think we're gonna be able to make this happen with little to no drama. Okay, that does seem to be staying with the RPMs better. Before, the tach was chasing the actual engine's RPMs. But now with the lag factor bumped up, there's still a touch of a lag, but it's a lot quicker. I think this is gonna be usable. So, that's one thing done. Now let's get the GPS speedo working. That should be just as easy.
that shows that you did, you probably have the antenna hooked up.
It's a little obstructed. I mean, is plastic too much for it to get through?
Possibly. I've run across issues with that actually happening and everything. A lot of people, even on some of even our own test vehicles we do, we put it on the dash itself so it still can always point through the windshield up toward the sky itself. So you should be good to go.
Sick, awesome, man. I appreciate it. All right, now that we got the speedo thing figured out with a little bit of head scratching, it's time to tackle the fuel level. Oh, dude. Oh, Jesus. So the first thing we got to do is find the factory wire that goes to the fuel level sender in the tank, the thing that tells the gauge how much fuel we got. So one of these 4 wires was responsible for sending the fuel level to the stock gauges. So now I just got to figure out which of the 4 wires it is. To do that, I'm going to look at the stock gauges real quick. Okay, so here we go. So there are 2 connectors on the back of these gauges, and conveniently all of the contacts on these connectors are labeled. All I gotta do is look at all the labels and find the one that says fuel. And it is right over yonder. Okay, so fuel goes to pin A on the driver's side connector. Okay, so now that we see that there, we're gonna go check the connector that's dangling where these gauges were, and we're gonna check for continuity between pin A and one of the 4 wires on that connector. Easy enough. To do that and actually check to see which wire connects back to that sensor, we're gonna have to use our multimeter. So I've got it set to our continuity, ohm testing, diode testing notch there, and you cycle through until the little audio wave shows up, and then anytime that these are effectively connected, you get a beep. Like that. So I'm gonna poke around at the connector and at that sensor till I hear a beep. Pretty easy. Okay, so pin A from the gauges is far driver side, so that's this guy. We'll just rest our probe in there like so. And just so you know, pin A is yellow. One of these 4 wires is yellow. So I'm gonna guess that that's the one. Okay, you see that yellow wire? Just gonna poke the front. Hey, we did it. All right, that's great news. So we're gonna use that wire ultimately to tell our ECU how much fuel we have, but it's not quite that easy. So as the fuel level changes, the voltage to this wire changes, and that determines our fuel level on the gauge. 5 volts as reference to our fuel level sender. And as the fuel level changes, that voltage gets changed as well. And so the voltage, as it's changed, we're gonna run that back in to our connector to an analog input. And then in the Mega Squirt, we can go in and set up our resistances and our values for what the things that this is sending us mean. So there's a few steps to this, but the first thing we gotta do is get it wired up. And then we'll have to plug in some data into the old computer. So the first thing we're gonna do is cut back some of the sheathing to expose our yellow wire. Now we're just gonna measure out the length of our wires roughly. You can always go a little bit long and trim it later. Now with our wires roughly cut, we can use our vampire clamps and clip them in to our fuel level wire. Okay, so these vampire clamps are pretty cool, but they can be a little bit tricky to make sure that they're in there properly with good connection between the wires you're trying to splice. So it's always a good idea to go ahead and check continuity like we did before, just to make sure that everything's connected. So I'm gonna go into the terminal at the plug up here, and then I'm gonna make sure that that is connected to the end of my new wire. And since it is, we know that our connection there is good, that is actually bridging the gap between the 2 wires. So, spectacular. Always good to check though. Now we'll do the next one, check it, and then we're off. stupendous. Okay, so now we can go ahead and put our resistor in line to the reference wire. Resistors are not polarity sensitive, so they can go in either way, doesn't matter. Alrighty, now for a little bit of protection. This is some heat shrink in assorted colors. Okay, so not only does that help protect us from any electrical shorts, but it also helps strengthen this section where we've just got one little resistor. So that's great. Now that's ready to wire into the ECU. So is this other wire. So now I just need to stick the correct jumpers out of my option plug on the back of the ECU. I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of sheathing over the pair of these wires, protect them a little more, and because it looks nice. Okay, so we've got our options port down here, and I'm on the internet, and I've got the diagram of what these pins are. So I'm looking for our 5-volt reference, and that's gonna be the wire that has the resistor in it. And then I'm looking for our analog input 1 or 2. I think I've got number 2 already used. So we can see that 5-volt reference is pin H up yonder, and analog 1 or 2 is C and D, so I'll use one of those. So let's get the 5-volt reference done first, plug that into H, and connect it to the one that I know has the resistor in it. So our fuel level sensor, like many and most sensors, is basically just a variable resistor. Depending on how much fuel is in the tank, that'll put the fuel level sensor at a different level and will create a different resistance. For like an oil pressure sensor, depending on how much pressure is being pushed on the sensor, will determine how much resistance that sensor gives off. So basically all we're doing here is sending a 5-volt reference to the sensor, and basically it puts a resistance into that circuit, and then we measure how much resistance there is, and then we correlate that to a fuel level or to an oil pressure. So since we've done the wiring, now all we got to do is go into the computer and plug in those resistances to tell the computer what to correlate an empty fuel tank to and a full fuel tank, and then everything in between. So we're basically going to go in the computer and mimic the stock fuel level setup with our wiring here. Got our values ready. So first thing, we're going to come up into the Megasquirt software, advanced engine. We're going to go to generic sensor inputs. So I'm going to go ahead and use analog in 1 as our source for the sensor. That's where we have the fuel level sensor running back into the ECU. So analog in 1, we will also name it fuel. 0 volt is -11. -11. And 5 volts is 380. That should be all the doing we need to do in there. Now, on my gauges here, I'm gonna set this guy right here up to be my fuel level gauge. Right click, and we're gonna go up here to our generic sensor inputs and hit fuel level, baby. And then look at that. Okay, now that we got our fuel level sensor handled, it's time to work on our oil pressure sensor. So our oil pressure sensor is very similar to our fuel level sensor in that it's a 5-volt sensor. Its resistance changes with changes in oil pressure, and we correlate that to actual oil pressure numbers on the dash. It's gonna be similar in wiring, we just gotta wire up that-a-way. So first I'm gonna put 2 wires in the car from the ECU area up to the front, through the firewall, and into the oil pressure sensor area. Okay, so wires are run through the firewall. That was pretty easy. Now for the part that I'm concerned might be a little tricky, which is getting to the oil pressure sensor area. So we'll see if I can get to it. It may be difficult. All right, there's no easy path to this thing from the top or the bottom, so I'm gonna have to get some stuff out of the way. I'm hoping that if I take off the oil filter and the sandwich plate that runs to the oil cooler, that'll give me enough access to get to this puppy from down here.
Get oil everywhere.
Not as bad as the coolant recently. Okay, there's that guy. And then direct the oil. Aha! Okay. Oh, now I can see it. I think we might just be able to do it. No problem. Okay, so this is obviously a lot smaller than the old one. This is an NPT thread, which is different than the thread that's in the block of the Miata. They are different by 1 thread per inch. Not much, but enough to matter and enough to leak. So I have an adapter to be our little go-between, and that's cool. The threads are also responsible for sealing whatever you're measuring. So for us, that's oil. So on a tapered thread, you're gonna wanna add thread sealant. Then we'll jam this thing in, then we've got this pigtail. And what we got going on here, one of these things is gonna be a ground to the chassis. One is gonna go to our analog port on the ECU, just like the fuel level sensor did. And the other is gonna go to our 5-volt reference on the ECU, just like our fuel sensor did. And then we'll basically have to do the same stuff in the ECU that we had to do to get our fuel level sensor working. So, you know, all these 5-volt sensors, kind of similar. Now it's important when you're soldering to just heat up the joint, heat up the wires that you're trying to solder together and poke the solder just into the wires. And once the wires are hot enough from the soldering gun, the wires themselves will melt the solder. If your solder doesn't get hot enough, it'll be even more brittle than if it was correctly up to temp. So always heat up your joint and then plow the solder just into the joint down the line a little bit. All right, let's get that heat shrink in place. Okay, so our soldering's done, our harness is on. Now we just need to find somewhere to ground this guy. Then we can pull the rest of our wire through the firewall. Luckily, this is gonna be pretty easy because I was doing a little bit of thinking ahead and I already spliced us a spare 5-volt reference off of the one we used for the fuel level. So all I gotta do is hook up our 5-volt reference wire to the 5-volt. Red wire is gonna be our analog signal back in to the old standalone. All right, so there we have it. The wiring is done. For now, let's hop into the ECU and see if we can get this puppy sensoring. Actually just on the Amazon page for this sensor. So basically this gives us everything that we need. It tells you the wiring pinout, which is what I use to wire this thing up. And then it also gives you the output voltage for different PSIs. So 0.5 volts, 0 PSI, 50 PSI is 2.5 volts, 100 PSI is 4.5 volts. So I basically just need to input those data points into the ECU like we did with the fuel level sensor. All right, analog in 1, oil pressure, linear sensor, 0 to 100, burnt. All right, so let's fire this thing up and see if we have any oil pressure. And so with that, we have made this car a lot more useful. I can tell how much fuel's in the tank. I can tell how much oil pressure's in the engine. I can tell how fast I'm going. So there's just one thing left to do. Sick of looking at this dash like this. Wow, that looks pretty good. It actually looks complete and I'm happy about it. And it actually is useful with a lot of useful information. So the Miata just got a lot better in my opinion. I'm very excited about this. So thanks again for watching. I hope you guys liked it and I hope you learned something. This episode was maybe a little bit more in the weeds than normal. You know, we're doing some pretty in-depth stuff. So I hope you liked it. Let us know if you did. And if you did, like the video and go follow me on Instagram and follow Donut Media while you're there. See you guys next Wednesday.